Hello, welcome to another historic story of Wookie Hole. My name's Neil. Today we're going to be wandering around the site and I'm going to be taking you around and stopping at various points and showing you how things have changed over the years. So the first point, we're going to walk around the path in front of what is the mainly an 1850s paper mill and go around the corner to where the original entrance of Wookey Hole Caves was when it opened back in 1927. So this present mill is mainly dating from the 1850s, late 1890s, when the mill was expanded, but there's been a paper mill here since 1610. In fact, there's been a mill that goes all the way back to Doomsday. And in the early days, there were actually two mills working using the river that comes out of the caves here. When you walk around this path, in front of the paper mill, there's a bridge. You can hardly see actually, because it's almost hidden by the sides of the houses opposite here. There's a very, very nice line drawing from the 1700s, which shows a bridge not too dissimilar to the one you can see just down here, with a big old house, which is no longer here, and the original mill that was dated in the 1700s. This mill is about halfway up the valley. You can't see from where we're standing, but there's a mill much, much further up on the right-hand side. What you've also got is over on the left, tucked in behind the trees, there's a building just sticking out from the trees here. This was originally the school. So when the Hodgkinsons built the paper mill, after a number of years, they actually also built a lot more for the village. So these people working in the paper mill, they had a school provided, they had houses provided up behind the trees up here, we can't see them. They had a pub, they had a church built and a chapel. But yeah, this is no longer a school, but it was a school built by the Hodgkinsons for the children of the workers in the paper mill. River's coming out from beneath here. This is the River Axe down here. This is the river coming out of the caves. Right, moving along the road in front of the paper mill, we come round to this part here. And this walkway where people now walk in, crossing over from the main attraction, this actually was the original way into the original Wookey Hole car park when it opened back in 1927. So cars would have driven up through here, and in those days this building here, which is today as our ice cream parlour, we can buy very nice ice creams, this was the gift shop and the museum. This building hasn't changed. This is exactly the same shape as it was back in the early days. And one person that worked here was a lady called Penelope Powell. Now, if you've watched any of our other films, there was a cave dive, the first ever cave dives in this country, back in July 1935. And Penelope Powell was the second diver to actually do a cave dive for real from Chamber 3. And Penelope worked here because this lady was employed by Wookey Hole Caves, and she actually was the manageress of what was then here was the gift shop and museum. And there's a nice postcard I have of a gentleman in a hat sitting over here somewhere, I'm guessing. He's sitting here. There's a little dog in the road, and you can see a nice view of this driveway into the car park. And of course, they had cars, they had charabancs in here. And in later years, on the right-hand side, where our hotel is now, there was a restaurant built, and even at one time there was an outdoor swimming pool. And when they opened the outdoor swimming pool, they had some people to come down to open it, including Olympic swimmers and divers on this opening occasion. And just to also point out, when they had the swimming pool here, the water was actually water coming directly out of the caves of Wookey Hole. The water was filtered and it was heated, but they were literally using the river water to fill the swimming pool that was here from the 1930s. So moving on from ice cream, which you can buy here in the ice cream parlour, there was, before the cave opened as a showcase, 1927, how it worked was the owner of the mill owned the cave, and they were quite happy for people to go in the cave. And there was a local farmer in the area here, and the farmer, he was called George Adlam. Now, George Adlam advertised in the local newspapers, and he advertised for 1 shilling that he would take you around the caves of Wookey Hole. So he would suggest you go to the house in the village, knock his door, and he would take you through the caves, much as we do today. Now, also at the bottom, it talks about a cream tea, because George Adlam, he farmed actually where the car park is, that was a field back in those days for him. It was a milk dairy farmer, and his wife, Mrs. Edlam, was a very, very prize-winning butter and cream maker, and she had prizes all over the country. I even found a report in a local newspaper that she won, I think it was first prize for cream and her butter in Birkenhead, which is quite a distance from Wookie Hole. Now, she kept some of this cream and butter in the caves, according to what I've discovered, so I'm guessing that's because the temperature there doesn't change, so a bit like the cheese we keep in there today. It was the same for her cream and butter. So yeah, you'd speak to Mr. Adlam, he would take you around the caves, and for an extra shilling after you come out of the caves, you could sit down and have a cream tea in Wookie Hole. So here we are standing on the path that takes you to the caves. This path hasn't changed in all the almost 100 years. There was, however, another path, because over here, just on my right, you can see some little stone slabs coming up the grass. That is part of what was a path, a step up into behind the trees today. And in the 20s, right the way through to the 1970s, there was a very ornate rose beds, flowers, benches, gravel paths. So you could wander up to the caves two ways. And in fact, you obviously could have a bit of a sit down before you made your way to the caves as well. That obviously has now no longer here, but I'm thinking from pictures of guidebooks that I collected that there's some probably disappeared in the early 1970s, but certainly at one time there were two ways up to the caves. On the right here, this is today our present day gift shop. Just over here, the first part of the paper mill, what was the paper mill. And again, in the early videos, you watch videos from the 1950s and 1960s, you can see people walking up and down the path here, but of course, this would have been a working paper mill. So when the caves opened and right up until the 1970s, really speaking, people visiting Wookey Hole Caves, that was your way up and you're down. You didn't go in here because this was a working paper mill. One little thing, just to point out, are the stones sticking out the side here. You can see them over there by the gate. There was a big 3-4 story house that disappeared probably in the late 1800s. Something to do with the paper mill, but that's the remains of what was a wall building out from the sides here. The paper mill itself, as I mentioned, this mainly dates from the 1850s, although the front part here, this dates from 1899, when the mill was expanded to its biggest point, and also the 1899 sort of period was when the mill was at its most productive, making as much paper as it ever had before. So anyway, we'll make our way up the path, and we will just stop just before the cave entrance for a few more things to show you. So behind me, we are really close to the entrance to the caves here at Wookey. Over here on the left, you can see the big high cliff face, and you might just hear the water sound of the river axe coming out of what we call the resurgence. The whole area, as I mentioned, has been lived in by people for thousands and thousands of years. One thing that they had here when they first opened, and it lasted, I reckon, until the 1970s, was a lookout. Now, just up here, where you wait now to go and see the caves, you can hear the river down beneath, and I discovered a photograph of what appears to be like a lookout. So there was this path leading from this cave path down a series of steps. The path went back on itself a couple of times. At the bottom there was a lookout with a fence around it, and the photograph I discovered was of I believe, Gerard Hodgkinson, the owner, standing down, looking down beneath to see the river coming out of the caves. It looked an amazing view. Now, we came up here to see if we could see anything that remains of this lookout, and the only thing that we found which might be related is behind this big stone wall, because down here on my left there looks to be like a bit of a little like valley shaped thing, and I'm wondering if that might have been the sides, the two edges of a path down onto this lookout viewpoint. And this area where the wall is, where we have a wall now, there are some massive stones. I mean, they're so big that I wonder if actually they've been sitting there all the time and they've just filled the wall in behind. But somewhere here, I think, is perhaps where the entrance to this lookout was. And then literally just up from where the viewpoint perhaps was, we have this plaque here. Now it does say Wookey Hole Caves 1992. That is actually for the building, because obviously this cave here has been open a lot longer than 1992. So yeah, this cave hut was built and opened for the cave guides in 1992. And again, you can see various versions of this thing before, right the way back to almost like a garden shed, sitting up here at the top of the cave path for the guides. And when the guides were here in the early days, right back in 1927, they had a uniform much different to what we wear today. They had a peak cap, jacket, trousers, and there's a photograph of a guide standing somewhere about here, because on the photograph, some of these big rocks here are part of a natural rock cave entrance, and you can actually see pretty much where this chap was standing. And then the other thing are those grey slabs, because these slabs here were the original way that people walked into the cave. The cave door today is a bit larger than what it was originally, because over here there was a couple of big boulders, which have obviously been moved in since then. But yeah, this here had a turnstile, so as you walked into the cave, you probably gave the guide your ticket, or he gave you a ticket, and then he wandered in through the turnstile into the caves. And of course, back in the early days, up until the 1970s, this was also the exit, so people would be coming back out the same way. The door, by the way, is almost, again, probably close to 100 years old. This door seems to appear on some of the early photographs of the caves. And actually, there's a very nice photograph just while I stood here of the owner, Gerard Hodgkinson, of Herbert Balch, the archaeologist from Wells, and various other people around them, sitting on an even earlier entrance to the cave here. Big rocks here, they're sitting up here. There's a little sign, I think it says 1 shilling entrance, no smoking kind of thing. And there's a picture of Gerard sitting there in the middle. And to his right is Herbert Balch looking forward towards the camera. When you make your way into the first part, which is called Goat Herder, obviously today we have concrete steps here, so obviously some work has been done on the entrance here, and it was obviously to make it easier to get people in here. One photograph, again, I think it's from the early 1920s, is quite different. There are rocks these people had to climb over. Just about where I'm standing, there's a big pile of rocks lying across this way, I think it is. So people were climbing over, making their way down into the show cave, but quite different to what you see here today. Now, having visited Wookey Hole, there is one thing I'm pretty confident you perhaps have missed out, because just here on my right, you can barely see it, but this thing here, these pieces of metal sticking out of the ground, there's a similar one I discovered down here, down behind the Wookey Hole. And what this is the base of what I think was the original lights that were put in here. Now, the original lights, as far as I understand it, the original lights were based on lights that were used in quarries. Gerard Hodgkinson, the owner, had been driving around the Mendip area. There's quite a few quarries in Mendip, and came across the idea that to use quarry lights to show people the caves when it opened. And again, through photographs, I found a photograph of a light unit which has a very circular base, which I'm guessing was bolted to these pieces of metal, and what you had on the top was more like a searchlight. The guide, I'm guessing, stood where I am, turning the light around to highlight the witch over here, the beehive, St Michael's Mount, and this one that we call the Giant. So I'm pretty sure this is where the guide would have stood when the tours were happening in the early days. The other thing about the caves when they first were set up was you went as far as Chamber 3 and you had to come back because of the river stopping you go any further. Now, people made their way down this way, but when people came out, so they didn't get all mixed together, the people leaving the cave with another guide would have walked up the steps on the far side. And before they left the cave, what they then did was walk up the steps over here. Now, this part of the cave we don't use today, but in behind here, there's a thing called the New Grotto, and that was called New Grotto when it opened in 1927. So yeah, people were taken up into this thing to have a look at some small stalagmites and stalactites, come back down, and then make their way back out into the cave path at the top of the hill. Now, I'm also holding here the very, very first guidebook that was made for Wookey Hole Caves. This was printed in 1927-28, written by a man called Alan Bell, and it describes the caves of Wookey Hole, the story of the witch. But what I really like at the end here is like a series of almost today's This is like their version of TripAdvisor, and it has various people's names in here and what they thought of their visit to Wookey Hole. So I'm just going to read a couple out. An example here is, let me have a look, E.N. Gibbon Barnett from Barnet, great historical interest. Miss Wilson says, wish I'd been the explorer. And on the other side here, you've got Doreen Smith. She thought it was spooky, and she was from London. And above her, there's a man called P.R. Boxfield of New York, who says simply, some humdinger of a place. Early reviews of Wookey Hole Caves. Okay, so I'm now standing in Chamber 9, what we now call Cathedral Chamber. The cave was found 1948 by the cave divers, and there's a photograph of one of the very first photographs actually of this chamber. I found it, and it was taken, I think, in about 1952, 1953. It shows the cave as it was by the divers, okay, and of course to get here, those divers were swimming all the way back from Chamber 3. None of the gantry you see in here today was here, none of the tunnels. This was a swim of about 25 minutes from Chamber 3, and one of the first photographs that was actually able to show people what Chamber 9 looked like. Outside, you can see the river just coming out the caves here. When the caves opened, as I said earlier on, there were only 3 chambers, so you had to come back out the way you walked in. So you'd have come out the cave, you can see the canopy up there, you'd have come out on top of it here. Now the one thing that was slightly different in the early days was actually there was a tea shop. Before the restaurant was built in what is now our car park, there was a tea shop here, and to get to it, you'd have gone down a series of steps off the side of the valley over here. Now where we have, strangely enough today, our valley refreshment, which you can see down here through the trees, its position is pretty much on the same site as where this early tea shop was. Now it was advertised as a commodious tea shop with lots of room and various things to purchase to eat or drink. And in one little story I found, which I thought was quite nice, it talks about a visitor who wrote an account, and when he visited here after seeing the caves, he came down to the tea shop, was greeted by a lady working in the tea shop, and he describes how each table had a very tidy, neatly folded blue and white gingham cloth on the table with flowers in the middle, and he was served by this lady working in the tea shop here. As I say, this I think survived for about 2 or 3 years before the bigger restaurant was opened in the car park. The other thing is very close to the bottom down there are some steps we no longer use, and those steps lead up to the path here where the mill stream is. And the other thing that visitors used to do, had access to, was the cave over here. Now today we can't go into this cave. It's called Hyena Den, cave that was excavated a lot by Herbert Bulch. But yeah, in the very early days of Wookey Hole Caves, people would walk down after their cave visit. They could grab a cup of tea over here in the tea shop, walk up those steps just over here on my left, and then get across a wooden bridge and have a look in at Hyena Den. Today at Wookey Hole, we have over here the 4D cinema, 4D theatre. The floor above though, just to go back to the old days when this was a paper mill, the floor above is what was called the cutting room. And if you go into the mill to look at the papermaking museum, you can actually see tables that were used when people worked up there cutting up clothing, because this mill was making paper from clothing, old rags. And that up there, that top floor, is where people spent all day cutting up clothing into small pieces. When visiting Wookey Hole, you can also visit our cave diving museum, which talks about the history of cave diving at Wookey Hole, and of course the first cave dive in this country. But inside here also, because this was a paper mill before, we have this big round thing in the corner over here. Now this actually was the boiler that was used to boil the rags. So from the room above next door, the little rag pieces were put in here and they were boiled overnight before being processed through to eventually fibres that the paper makers would then use to make their cotton paper, which was made here for so many hundreds of years. As big as it is as well, you can see the size of this thing. This was brought down off the top of the Mendip Hills, about 5 miles from here, and it was brought down very steep hills by 13 horses. I'm guessing most of them behind this thing to pull it back. But yeah, this was brought down off the top of the Mendips from an old lead mine that had closed down. Here we are standing on the side of Wookey Hole Theatre. This is where the circus shows happen at weekends and school holidays, during Somerset school holidays. And the theatre is actually where, when this was a paper mill, this is where the paper was made, because background when we were talking about the boiler, the machines that ground the pieces of cotton down to fibres were up on the upper floor, and from here the cotton fibres and water were sent down to this floor. So literally all the floor space through here is where the paper makers worked. At its peak, the mill had 13 vats. A vat is a tank on the floor where the vat man stood and made the sheets of paper. And between the vat man and the coopcher, who was the other person involved, a good day's work for those people was 500 sheets of paper a day. So bear in mind you had 13 vats. This mill was probably turning out about 2,500 sheets of paper a day, which doesn't sound a lot, but of course what it was used for was very special things like legal papers, share certificates, and a lot of paper went across for other countries for their banknotes, which they were using back in those days. So yeah, this is where the paper makers worked, making the paper for the old paper mill. The final process where the paper making was happening here was drying the paper. So paper was made downstairs. When it was brought up to this floor, which today I'm studying in the modern museum here at Wookie Hole, but through here, where we have our play barns that lead through to the theatre, this was one of 3 drying lofts. And what was happening in here was the paper was sometimes hung up on ropes, and in little bundles of 3 or 5 sheets of paper. They were left up on the roof to dry for between 3 to 5 days. But this which we now have as the play barn was one of the 3 drying lofts here at the mill. The photograph where I'm standing now was taken in the 1900s. Had to be, because this part of the building didn't exist until the early 1900s. Just over here though is a gate we still close when we close this site at the end of the day. On the wall just by the side of the gate is a sign. It says, "Please shut the gate. The penalty is 40 shillings for leaving this gate unlocked," okay? Now, it depends obviously when this was put up, but if let's take 1900 as a guess, maybe that's when it was put up. That would mean that if I forgot to lock this gate and go home, I would be looking at a fine of about £300. And for that, I'm going to close that gate.